Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. This hearing is entitled Restricting Rogue State Revenue, Strengthening Energy Sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Opening statements. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Thank you to our very impressive set of witnesses for being here today. You each possess tremendous expertise on global energy economics and sanctions, and we look forward to your insights. This hearing is entitled Restricting Rogue State Revenue, Strengthening Energy Sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. When our subcommittee last convened on October 25th, in the wake of the horrific terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas, we examined the sanctions regime against the nation that stands behind and funded the barbarism, Iran. Our expert witnesses informed us of the sources of revenue of the Iranian state, most of which relate to the export of hydrocarbons and related products, and the means, illicit or authorized, by which Iran is able to access those funds. Today, as promised, we will expand that discussion. As it happens, not just Iran, but 2 other countries in the new axis of evil are petrostates, or something to that effect, Russia and Venezuela. These 3 countries' dependence on a single category of exports should provide the United States and our allies with substantial leverage over their economies, as the global market for these commodities is large and liquid. Moreover, the United States is one of the largest producers in the world, as are several of our historically close allies, notably Saudi Arabia, the world's largest swing producer. Unfortunately, as other committees of this Congress have explored, the Biden administration has suppressed or impeded North American hydrocarbon production, even as they have emptied out our emergency reserves for short-term political points. At the same time, the Biden administration has taken a consistently weak approach to enforcing the energy sanctions that would have the strongest economic impact on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Iran's ghost fleet continues to feed the Chinese industrial economy and its teapot refineries with little effort to stop the flow by the United States. Russia's oil and gas, the most economically significant exports, have been either excluded from sanctions or subjected to a fake control scheme that either set the price cap above the market price for Urals or, when that was exceeded, exempted the exports. Finally, the administration's efforts to allow Venezuela to export more oil have been foiled by the Maduro administration's incompetence that has gutted their technological capabilities. Overall, this weak approach to energy sanctions has had the domestic political benefit of putting a material downward pressure on the price of oil, but with the negative consequence of enriching those enemy states while hurting domestic producers. Furthermore, unlike the United States, China depends on imported energy, so the ability to import deeply discounted gas and oil from all 3 countries has been a substantial benefit to our main strategic rival. Overall, the administration's approach to the global hydrocarbon market is backwards and strategically counterproductive. Iran has been emboldened to throw its weight around the Middle East from Yemen to Gaza, with it or its proxies directly attacking U.S. military sites and warships essentially without consequence. Continued oil revenues have allowed Russia's economy to weather the ostracism and wide-ranging financial actions taken in 2022, which were widely predicted to be catastrophic. They were not, and Moscow has been able to continue its unprovoked, brutal, and unjust war against Ukraine. Finally, the Biden administration waived energy sanctions against Venezuela purportedly in a naive hope that this communist dictatorship would allow a free election. Humiliatingly, this last week, the Venezuelan dictator threatened to annex the oil-rich provinces of its peaceful neighbor Guyana. It seems that in just 2 years, the Biden administration's wrong-headed energy policies may have helped start or sustain wars on 3 separate continents. That's quite a record. Instead, the United States and our allies should return to an approach of strongly reinforcing energy sanctions against these rogue regimes to weaken our enemies. At the same time, we should strengthen the United States by unleashing hydrocarbon production in free countries with high environmental and human rights standards like the United States, Canada, and our allies. We should be working with our friends to maintain low prices and high global supply, even while reducing the share that these rogue states provide. Today, we will explore what such an approach could look like by better understanding the energy economics and vulnerabilities of each of these countries so that we can legislate solutions and pressure them. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today to discuss, as we've already heard, the United States energy-related sanctions against Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, and the various methods of invading these sanctions. Under the Biden administration, the United States maintained the most extensive set of comprehensive sanctions against Iran, including those related to the illicit sale of Iranian oil, following Hamas's violent, unprecedented attack on Israel on October the 7th, which we all witnessed. The Treasury Department has issued multiple rounds of sanctions targeting those involved in the illicit finance networks that fund Hamas and Iran, its primary state sponsor. Contrary to the accusations leveled by Republicans, Secretary Yellen recently set the record straight that, quote, "We have not in any way relaxed our sanctions on Iranian oil. Against Russia, the United States has long maintained a robust sanctions program and has only doubled down since its unprovoked 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The Treasury Department, including the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, has engaged in a historic effort to implement sanctions, identify oligarchs' dirty money, and hamper financial support to Russian war machine, map networks of bad actors, and pursue sanction invaders. In addition, the Biden administration and Congress have worked closely to squeeze Russians' benefit from the sale of its oil, imposing a novel program, a price cap on seaborne oil exports in collaboration with other G7 countries and Australia. Secretary Yellen recently confirmed that the price cap on Russian oil has significantly reduced Russian revenue over the last 10 months while promoting stable energy markets. Lastly, in Venezuela, the United States has long imposed sanctions for criminal, anti-democratic, and corrupt activity. And the Biden administration has sought to leverage limited sanctions relief to incentivize a path towards freer and fairer elections. As we speak, our allies around the world are under attack, including Ukraine, which is set to run out of money in just a few weeks. Meanwhile, some of my colleagues across the aisle are holding aid to Israel and Ukraine hostage to push through their political agendas. Further underscoring the hypocrisy in this discussion about serious national security matters is the fact that the House GOP appropriation bills significantly cut the funding of the very agencies needed to implement Treasury sanctions and invasion detection. As we navigate various global crises and assets, the national security tools at our disposal, it is essential that we remain tough against our adversaries and leverage diplomacy to ensure our allies that they can trust us. By employing a multilateral approach to the United States national security, the Biden administration has demonstrated steady leadership in the face of global instability. In tandem, congressional Democrats have taken legislative steps to prevent sanction evasions and eliminate vulnerabilities in our financial system. But with all that said, I look forward to continuing this important work and working together. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. With that, we recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lukemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty. We're here today to discuss how we can strengthen energy-related sanctions on Iran, Russia, and Venezuela in order to prevent them from funneling funds to terrorism and other harmful activities. But Republicans have proposed to slash funding for the very agencies responsible for sanctions enforcement by 30%. We cannot expect to have robust sanctions enforcement without robust funding for the agencies in charge of enforcement. Moreover, We cannot expect to be tough on Russia if we walk away from Ukraine. Not only would that hand a major victory to Vladimir Putin, it would embolden China's ambitions to invade Taiwan. So I urge my Republican colleagues to pass President Biden's supplemental package, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. With that, we'll begin the testimony of our witnesses. We thank each of you for being here today. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. And with that, we'll go to introductions. The Honorable Marshall Billingsley. Mr. Billingsley is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Welcome. Ms. Claire Youngman is Chief of Staff at United Against Nuclear Iran. Welcome. Dr. Anna Mikulski is a senior fellow at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome. Mr. Ryan Berg is Director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome. And we welcome Mr. Adam Smith, who is a partner at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Again, as I mentioned, be sure you get the microphones right close to you. Each of you are recognized for 5 minutes. With that, we'll begin with Mr. Billingsley. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. It's a pleasure to be here before your subcommittee to discuss this quite important set of issues. At the outset, I must say that autocratic regimes have for years tried to advance the narrative that sanctions, quote unquote, don't work for obvious reasons. And now some in Washington, D.C. are beginning to parrot their talking points. This is concerning. To say that sanctions don't or can't work would be incorrect, and it's an assertion that is completely at odds with the results we achieved during my tenure at the Department of the Treasury under President Trump. Sanctions do work when they are applied properly and enforced. Applied properly means, in my view, 5 things. First, as part of a broader strategy. Sanctions are not a substitute for strategy, but a complement. 2, not symbolic. Sanctions have an effect when the target has exposure to the global financial system, but conversely, when the target is unconnected, sanctions are little more than virtue signaling. They need to be applied comprehensively, without loopholes. Fourthly, they need to be accompanied by secondary sanctions to deter non-U.S. third parties who otherwise might be inclined to continue transaction with a sanctioned entity. And then finally, they have to be enforced through a mix of both civil and criminal penalties. As I mentioned under President Trump, all 5 of these criteria were met by our Iran and Venezuela efforts. I would parenthetically add our North Korea program as well. The effect on the energy-related revenue streams of the mullahs in Tehran and the murderous kleptocrat regime in Caracas was significant. Iranian crude oil production collapsed from 3.8 million barrels a day in 2018 when we started, down to 1.8 million by the time we left office. And their exports similarly crashed due to our efforts. They were exporting less than 400,000 barrels a day, and they had a huge number of cargo ships serving as floating storage because secondary sanctions were effectively deterring a number of countries, such as India and China, from buying. The corresponding effect on the Iranian regime's finances was equally dramatic. Iran's GDP shrank by 5% in 2018 and another 10% year over year in 2019. Inflation spiked, going up 10% to approximately 35% during this time frame, and the Iranian currency hit all-time lows. As its economy shrank and oil and tax revenues dried up, the regime found that its own budget was in disarray, its military spending took a huge hit, and although Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force at the time, fought aggressively to protect his terror financing, he too was forced to take major cuts. In fact, to make ends meet, the Quds Force resorted to its own oil smuggling efforts in collaboration with Hezbollah and Russia, and we disrupted a wide number of these schemes through law enforcement, intelligence, and Treasury action. The effect on Iran's terror network was notable. Although the best funded of Iran's proxies by far, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was forced to make major cutbacks in stipends for his members, and he repeatedly complained about us at the Treasury. He even started fundraising telethons in an effort to make up the losses in Iranian payments. In Venezuela, we saw a very similar pattern. Once we designated the central bank and all of the other major financial institutions and applied secondary sanctions to its oil trade, Venezuela's crude oil output dropped from 2.3 million barrels a day to just around 400,000 by the end of the Trump administration. Hyperinflation was rampant, and in 2018, the Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, became the least valued currency in circulation based on exchange rates. These results speak for themselves. They prove that sanctions can significantly impair the revenue of hostile energy-producing regimes, provided that the 5 principles I enumerated are followed. But here we are at the end of 2023. Iran's oil production has bounced back to a 5-year high, to between 3.1 and 3.3 million barrels a day. They're exporting 4 times as much crude and condensate today than they were when we left office. Hassan Nasrallah is no longer needing to conduct telethons. The Houthis are engaged in unprecedented ballistic cruise and drone strikes against both Israel and shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias have conducted 92 attacks on U.S. servicemen in Iraq and Syria since October 17th, and we saw what an emboldened Hamas did on October 7th. In Venezuela, crude oil production has nearly doubled, up to a record high over the summer, nearly 800,000 barrels a day. And the Biden administration has now waived most of our energy sanctions, but what Maduro has decided to do, and thanks for that, is mass troops on the border of Guyana, threatening forcible annexation of the oil and mineral-rich Essequibo region. I also have a fair amount to comment on with regard to the Russia sanctions program. Suffice to say that I feel it has been largely ineffective because, again, it does not include the 5 criteria that I enumerated, but I would be happy to address that in the questions and answers. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Billingsley. Dr. Youngman, you're up next. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the administration's strategy for enforcing sanctions against Iran, focusing on the oil sector and its implications for national security, global oil markets, and international financial stability. Iran's oil sector is its major economic pillar, with exports representing the overwhelming majority of government revenues. Because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, controls the oil industry, oil exports finance Iran's military and terrorist operations, with over $20 billion funneled into such activities since 2012. U.S. sanctions, when stringently enforced, have effectively countered Iran's nuclear ambitions and limited its funding of terror. The maximum pressure campaign from 2017 to 2021 significantly reduced Iran's oil exports, demonstrating the potency of robust sanctions. However, due to diminished sanctions enforcement, Iran has accumulated north of $80 billion in oil revenues since 2021, particularly through exports to China. This leniency has not only altered the global oil market dynamics, but also weakened the perceived effectiveness of sanctions. Iran uses a ghost fleet of more than 300 foreign-owned and foreign-flagged oil tankers to ship hundreds of millions of barrels of Iranian oil, skirting U.S. energy sanctions and exploiting regulatory loopholes. Most of these vessels are not sanctioned by the U.S. and operate clandestinely. Further, Panama in particular has facilitated Iran's oil sanctions evasion by flagging almost half of the ghost fleet vessels in spite of over 65 letters from United Against Nuclear Iran, providing concrete evidence that those ships are carrying Iranian oil. Moving forward, a comprehensive strategy is crucial. This includes increasing sanctions enforcement, focusing on Iran's ghost fleet, implementing economic and regulatory pressure in China, using carrots and sticks to encourage Panama's cooperation, and enhancing global maritime surveillance. Thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Youngman. Ms. Mikulski, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Hold on. Oh, still not on. Okay. Still not working? Can we swap one of the, can you put one of those in the middle there between you two? There we go. We'll get some technical support here in a second. Very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is on the Hill today to plead for military aid, we are about to discuss what's possibly second to that aid in pushing back against Putin. Economic sanctions, where properly applied and enforced, can be a useful tool of influence. Having lived in communist Poland under President Reagan's sanctions in the 80s, I should know. Sanctions generally prove most effective before they are applied. Once applied, the immediate effectiveness can be mitigated by various factors such as domestic policies, economic fluctuations, or geopolitical conditions. Absence of broad multilateral application or enforcement can further undermine their effectiveness. As such, even though sanctions are usually applied with the hope to curb promptly an adverse behavior, actual realization of their objective requires a more protracted timeline. For petrostates, such as Russia, Venezuela, or Iran, sanctions targeting their energy exports have traditionally been employed with the objective of depriving these nations of revenues, thereby constraining their military capabilities and eroding the popularity of their governments. Admittedly, sanctions on Russian energy flows imposed after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine have produced mixed results. The reasons are complex. To begin, Russia was able to prepare, particularly after very limited sanctions were imposed on Russia after 2014 invasion on Ukraine. The country began to form more self-reliant financial system, domestic production and self-sufficiency were the key. Devaluating ruble to enhance competitiveness and aid budget was also one of the major things Russia has focused on, as foreign currency from oil and gas have translated into greater value in the domestic context. Partnerships with China and OPEC have been also very high on Russia's agenda. Secondly, sanctions imposed after 2022 invasion, though more expansive, have not been well enforced. In particular, despite cap on crude oil prices introduced by G7 countries over a year ago, Russia has been able to sell its crude above the price thanks to widespread evasion and a shadow fleet of tankers it has built. At time, lower prices of oil have also yielded the cap inadequate. This does not mean, however, there are no signs of sanctions working their way through Russian economy. For example, the devaluation of ruble has kept Russian revenue high and rising, but only if expressed in rubles. Translated to American dollars, Russian federal revenues are falling. In addition, the share of Russian revenues from oil and gas activity is also falling to be now in around the 30%, 35%. Also, the financial strategy of relying on taxation of energy production instead of taxation of exports is going to have negative implications for Russia's energy sector. While this approach may help finance state coffers, the heavy taxation will limit the ability of Russian energy companies to grow and invest. The lack of cutting-edge technology and the phenomenon of brain drain is likely to impact the efficiency, quality, and innovation of Russia's energy sector in the long term. As of now, however, much also of Russian energy flows have not been sanctions. This includes natural gas, particularly liquefied natural gas, where Russian sales doubled when compared to 2021. And I'm talking here about sanctions from our allies, in particular the EU, where half of these LNG exports have been going. Russia is also supplying nuclear fuel and building and financing nuclear power plants all over the world, which includes 2 NATO countries, Hungary and Turkey. As we consider existing and future options, we need to remember that the success of sanctions is usually not immediate and that imposition of tough measures is not enough unless robust and strict enforcement follows. The lack of enforcement not only diminishes the intended impact of the sanctions on reducing Russian capability to support their ongoing aggression in Ukraine, it also poses a risk to the long-term efficacy of a broader system today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Berg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning on this very important topic. Under the Biden administration, the United States has embarked on a perilous dance with the dictator in Caracas. Absent a policy reboot, I worry that the next step in this caper with Nicolas Maduro could be strategic insolvency against an adversarial regime in our shared neighborhood. Whereas the previous administration built a significant sanctions architecture on the Maduro regime to stymie its myriad human rights abuses and unfathomable corruption, the Biden administration has presided over a significant softening of Venezuela's sanctions. This is a major test of the administration's ability to reach what has been a bipartisan goal: freer and fairer presidential elections in Venezuela on a much longer road to full redemocratization. After a skinny set of accords recently signed in Barbados, the Biden administration gambled, lifting oil, gas, minerals, and secondary bond trading sanctions on the regime. The sanctions relief, originally provided for 6 months and subject to renewal in April 2024, could be worth as much as $10 billion in revenue for Maduro, representing about 1/10 of Venezuela's current GDP. 7 weeks in, there is nary a commitment in the agreements that the regime has not managed to contravene. The litany of violations is worth considering when weighing the merits of the regime's recent sanctions relief. The regime censored, harassed, and intimidated journalists covering the opposition's recent primary. It cut the internet during the transmission of poll results for the opposition's recent primary. On the day of the primary, multiple polling stations reported shots fired, intimidation by regime thugs, and ballot boxes stolen. After opposition leader Maria Corina Machado emerged victorious, the regime's attorney general launched an investigation into the primary process, labeling it, quote, a mega fraud. Through its control of the Supreme Court, the Maduro regime suspended the results of the opposition's primary, declaring them null and void. As part of the investigation, the Maduro regime has demanded some of the primary organizers to appear before local prosecutors. As part of its investigation, the regime has demanded information on those who participated in a bid to compromise the identities of nearly 2.5 million people, potentially exposing them to retribution. As the ink was drying on the Barbados Accords, the regime abducted and now holds another American political prisoner, Savoy Wright. No unjustly detained Americans have been released since the Barbados Accord. Following the referendum on December 3rd, the Maduro regime has ramped up bellicose rhetoric and now threatens to annex more than 2/3 of territory administered by neighboring Guyana. In my remaining time, I want to move to some policy recommendations for Venezuela. First and foremost, I think we need to decouple Venezuela policy from U.S. energy security. There is a siren song that is emerging from Caracas. It's been going on for years. And the U.S. government must not fall into the trap and dispense with the fallacy that the Maduro regime can be a guarantor of U.S. energy security. The goal of U.S. policy should be to be energy dominant and untether these considerations as to ensure clear-eyed policy toward an adversary. A sanctions-free Venezuela has a marginal potential production increase, and it's only managed to increase its production in recent weeks by about 200,000 barrels of oil per day, which is negligible on the world stage. Further, the environmental crimes and the unfolding environmental catastrophe in Venezuela is of grave concern and makes us complicit in PDVSA's abysmal environmental record. Second, treat the U.S. government's word as sacred. After the signing of the Barbados Accords, the Biden administration threatened sanctions snapback. But without a willingness to pull the trigger, the regime is calling our bluff. To quote a recent Washington Post op-ed, quote, if the Secretary of State vows to take specific action by a specific date and then does not, the world will notice and assume the United States is not serious. Mr. Maduro undoubtedly will draw the same conclusion, that he can pocket the gains of sanction relief while not paying the price demanded by Mr. Blinken, and no one will do anything about it, close quote. Third, reboot sanctions policy on Venezuela and consider the Barbados Accords the erstwhile Barbados Accords. The U.S. government would be wise to reboot its sanctions policy with a focus on building leverage toward lifting bans on opposition candidates. U.S. strategy toward Venezuela must be guided by two clear goals. First is, as I said, the bipartisan goal of a freer and fairer election as the starting point for a long process of redemocratization. And second, and more immediately, Maria Corina Machado's ability to present herself as a candidate in the 2024 presidential election. The Biden administration thus far has struggled to leverage sanctions to see these two goals converge in Venezuela. And finally, recommit to sanctions enforcement. Even before the Biden administration's sanctions relief, the architecture on Maduro had stopped biting. Sanctions are only as good as their enforcement. Now, detractors normally point out the game of whack-a-mole that ensues, but a strong architecture is contingent upon creative and vigilant enforcement. Before, we knew all of the routes, the transshipment points, and when they were loading in Venezuela, and China was the top recipient of that sanctioned oil. With that, I yield, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burt. Mr. Smith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, ranking member, members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. There is no question that Moscow, Tehran, Caracas continue to engage in activities that undermine national security. There's also no question that the regime's continued monetization of their energy resources is enabling them to do so. However, as I detail in my written testimony, the Biden administration can point to significant accomplishments in limiting the ability of these regimes to profit from their energy resources and to continue their destabilization in the manner they would prefer. However, given the reality of the continued behavior, more can and should be done. As I'll describe, in some cases, I argue that no new energy sanctions themselves are needed. Rather, enhanced enforcement of current measures and strengthened multilateral coordination may be the most effective way ahead. Before providing some suggestions on next steps for each of these regimes, I want to lay out 4 broader interests, much as Mr. Billingsley did, that I think we need to keep in mind as we consider our sanctions approaches. First, while recognizing the significant threats stemming from Caracas, Moscow, Tehran, we need to also recognize the enduring threats that emanate from outside these states, in particular China. This doesn't mean that sanctions on these regions cannot include Chinese entities. They can and they should. However, it does mean that we don't further our interests if we pursue sanction strategies that result in any currently fence-sitting states to rush into the arms of Beijing. Second, we must be conscious that any efforts to eliminate supply from these jurisdictions could result in supply and price shocks here at home and amongst our allies. Third, we've learned that multilateral sanctions measures are far more coercively effective than unilateral measures, especially when you're dealing with large economies like Russia. Indeed, true unilateral measures could have the counterproductive effect of diminishing the overall effectiveness of our tools. And fourth, we need to remain aware of both the purposes and true targets of our sanctions. Sanctions are a tool of behavior change and deterrence. They must have an off-ramp. And our sanctions are targeted at governments and not citizens. So any sanctions enhancements must aim to help, or at least not hurt, citizens, even as pressure on governments may increase. Turning now to each particular program. In Russia, domestically, we need to focus on continuing our enforcement of the oil price cap, sanctions, export control violations, and we need to support and fully fund the independent and integrated work of Treasury, DOJ, Commerce, and other agencies. Internationally, we need to build on the broad multilateral coordination that the Biden administration has put together, including the G7's enforcement coordination mechanism. The EU continues to pressure Moscow, and the direction of travel here is clear. The EU is currently considering a tool that would allow its member states to unilaterally move against Russian energy, unprecedented. And we need to encourage EU to enforce and to find other sources for third-party country imports of oil, many of which come from Russian crude. With respect to destinations of Russian oil, we need a balance. With respect to India, the leading purchaser of Russian crude, we must balance our desire to grow our bilateral relationship while discouraging Delhi's reliance on Russian oil. One potential option would be to borrow a page from Iran sanctions and consider a significant reduction exception program, an SRE that would threaten but hold off on sanctions against parties involved in the importation of Russian oil, so long as India would be reducing its Russian oil imports, might be an effective strategy. With respect to China, a continued focus on enforcement against critical intermediaries may be effective, and it would be especially powerful if global partners were able to join us. For Iran, the lowest hanging fruit stems from the fact that U.S. sanctions are principally unilateral. If we were to get the EU, the UK, and other partners on board, the force multiplier would be significant. Second, we need to calibrate our measures in Iran to target the government and not civilians. Fungibility is a real dilemma. If we allow Iran to have money in one sphere, they'll be able to use an equal amount to engage in nefarious acts. However, the problem of fungibility as it relates to U.S. interests only principally emerges once fungible monies are spent by Iran to acquire troubling items or export goods or funds to its proxies. As such, we need to pursue two things simultaneously. First, we need to promote real humanitarian trade, which may require formal assurances of the private sector. And second, we need to enhance surveillance over and actions concerning moves of funds and goods across the Iranian border, both out to troubling actors, Hamas, the Houthis, etc., and coming into Iran to support their nuclear program, missile development, etc. On Venezuela, I argue that Venezuela is actually, Maduro is the weakest of the three leaders in question. And recently, sanctions have proven that we actually do have leverage. Even though there clearly have been slides from Maduro's promises, that leverage needs to sort of be engaged again. Maduro has proven amenable to some sort of quid pro quo of sanctions relief for some moves for democratization. In conclusion, we must remember that our policy with respect to these states is not to increase sanctions for their own sake. Sanctions are a means to our goal, which is, of course, to eliminate the ability of these states to exercise harm to our national security. And sanctions are only one tool in our policy arsenal, and alone they will be unlikely to achieve our objectives. However, when paired with broader efforts, military, intel, law enforcement, diplomatic, development, etc., and bringing on board our multilateral partners to do the same, sanctions can be a force multiplier and prove determinative. With that, thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll now turn to our member questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. On November 30th, the oil cartel, OPEC, agreed to cut their oil production by around 1 million barrels a day to try and keep prices elevated. Saudi Arabia also agreed to extend the million barrel a day cut that it announced in June. Each of you talked a minute ago about the amount of oil that's coming out of each one of these three countries we're talking about today. Mr. Billingsley, would you comment on the effect that our lax sanctions, each one of you talked about sanctions need to be enforced more, that we're not doing enough. And Mr. Smith mentioned a minute ago that we seem to be unilaterally having these sanctions with not much other help from other countries. So, Mr. Billingsley, would you like to comment on the effect of those lax sanctions with regards to the effect it has on global energy markets? And do you see a strategy behind that?
Well, no, I don't see a coherent strategy. In the case of Iran, it has been lax enforcement. In the case of Venezuela, they've actually waived the sanctions, as Dr. Berg indicated. But when you consider the OPEC cut, or rather the continuation by the Saudis of their cut of 1 million barrels a day in Saudi production, well, that's more than made up for by the surges in production coming out of Iran and Venezuela together, to say nothing of Russia. So were we to simply clamp down on Venezuela and Iran to any great extent, there would be actually no reason for the Saudis to engage in a production cut to achieve the price effect that they're trying to have.
We see a lot of things in the news about China talking to each one of these three countries a lot, especially with regards to oil. And there seems to be, as I recall, this spring, I think they signed an agreement, with Russia and with Iran, or some of the Middle Eastern countries anyway, to provide them more oil to shore up one of their, I think, two big weaknesses. Do you see all these three countries working with China in cohesion? Is there something that they're working together, or is this China working independently with each one of these three countries?
Well, no, I think there are triangular activities that are occurring. Obviously, we all follow the Iranian-Russian relationship and their provision of drones to the Russians to attack Ukrainian civilians with, as well as their military. China and Russia's increasingly becoming a dependent state on China economically. If you look at the balance of trade shifts, China is increasingly dominant with regard to the Russian economy and its imports. But China has its own motivations in the Middle East in particular. As Xi Jinping grows increasingly threatening towards Taiwan, China is looking for every which mechanism to displace the United States and our influence in the region, which is why it really was a diplomatic fiasco to see them step in, they, the Chinese, to broker rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians. Because, of course, in the end, what Iran wants is unfettered and free-flowing access to Saudi oil in the event of a crisis.
I sit on the China Task Force, so I'm kind of all things China anymore. And so I know, Ms. Youngman, you talked a little bit about the Ghost Fleet and enabling China to get access to a lot of this oil through Panamanian tankers. Would you like to elaborate on it a little bit and explain how we can find a way to curtail that activity, or is there a way to do that? Is Panama not working with us? Are they no longer a friend? I know China kind of has they either own or operate the Panama Canal now, if I'm not mistaken. They have a lot of interest in that. So can you give us how all that fits together?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen Iranian oil exports to China increase over the last few years, 400 million barrels so far this year, 313 in 2022, 291 million in 2021. So every year, the number of barrels of Iranian oil to China is going up. And a big part of that is through the use of the Ghost Fleet. When United Against Nuclear Iran first started publishing our list of vessels involved in this type of activity, it was around 70 vessels. This list has grown to 364 as of our most recent
364 of Panamanian vessels?
364 vessels in the Ghost Fleet.
Oh, in the Ghost, okay.
48% of those, though, are flagged by Panama.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, almost half of the entire Ghost Fleet. And that's just looking at vessels transporting Iranian oil. If you added in vessels transporting Russian or Venezuelan, that number could be much higher.
How do you think we can curtail that?
I think there needs to be a pressure on Panama. I think that United Against Nuclear Iran, for example, has written over 65 different letters to the Panamanian Maritime Authority, provided them with bills of lading, satellite imagery, and so on, showing these vessels transporting this type of oil, and they've taken little to no action. I think there needs to be a significant
Stronger
amount of
action
pressure.
taken. Stronger action taken. Okay. Thank you very much. My time's expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Smith, some of our colleagues across the aisle propose that we abandon the Biden administration's and the G7's price caps policy to go it alone with a unilateral American ban on Russia oil exports, threatening and enforcing with secondary sanctions for purchases of Russian oil. Can you discuss the benefits of the current price cap policy and explain the impact of abandoning it, both with respect to Russia's oil revenue, which we kind of touched on with the chairman's question, and fuel prices here at home?
Thank you, Ranking Member. So I'm a big believer, not just in the price cap itself, but in the price cap as a part of a broader suite of measures. If you look at the price cap on its own, one could argue that because exports of Russian oil are up, that therefore demonstrates a weakness in the price cap. And that's true to a point. However, when you recognize that India is the largest importer and they are paying the Russians in rupees, which they can't use, and Sergei Lavrov has made that very clear, that they're collecting a lot of rupees at their bank accounts in Delhi and Mumbai, and they can't use them. It's not clear to me that this price cap is actually having as big a help to Russia as one might imagine. Additionally, looking at it just on its own, I think is a mistake. It's the broad specter of broader sanctions. And again, the problem with removing the price cap and going it alone from a unilateral perspective is just that. It's one thing with respect to Iran to go it alone, and we did it fairly successfully leading up to the nuclear deal. But Iran is a minnow compared to Russia, and the reliance upon our allies, core allies in Europe and also in East Asia, on Russia is significantly greater than it was on Iran, which means that the likelihood of splintering that multilateral portion of the really important engagement, I think, is very high if we're not careful. If we were to remove that, my guess is that's what would happen. There would be significant pressure that the U.S. would have to put on parties that are unable to go there from the perspective of the Europeans and the West and East Asians. The other problem, of course, is India. Right? I do not think it makes much sense on a long-term basis, principally because of China, to sort of alienate Delhi in this way. And I think there's a way we can actually have both things true.
Okay, thank you. Let me kind of switch to this, Mr. Smith. There's been, as we've heard, extensive discussions about banning humanitarian exceptions to comprehensive sanctions, especially within respect to the Iran programs. This is a recent shift. After decades of strong bipartisan support for allowing transactions of things like food and agriculture, commodities, medicine, et cetera, to go to the people of sanctioned nations. Why are humanitarian exceptions important, and how does Treasury monitor the use of waivers, licenses, and other exceptions?
Well, humanitarian exceptions are important, I would argue, for moral reasons, as well as political and strategic reasons. Right? The importance, obviously, of not allowing people to die from absent cancer medicines or foods, I think, is sort of self-evident. I would hope it is self-evident to everyone in this room. But the other issue, of course, is there's some soft power associated with the U.S. providing largesse or providing goods and services on a humanitarian basis. The real concern, and we saw this very much in the context of the $6 billion in Qatar that was potentially going to be released to Iran, was the question of fungibility. Namely, that if you give $6 billion worth of humanitarian aid to Iran, they have $6 billion somewhere else in the budget to do bad activities. That's undoubtedly true. However, the fungibility concern actually speaks more to the importance of enforcement than it does to removing humanitarian trade. Because the real problem for Iran is not that they're getting $6 billion into the system. Rather, it's their ability to use those $6 billion to buy things, to send to Hamas, to send to Houthis, and that means that we need to up our game with respect to surveillance and actions in the Treasury space, as well as in the military intel space.
Thank you. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, for the record, and it's been mentioned by our witnesses that we know President Zelensky is in Washington today, obviously asking for our support and not stalling in Congress to provide those funds. And I'd just like to echo the sentiments made by some of our witnesses that it is absolutely critical that we continue to provide aid to the Ukraine. And it can also, so they can also defend themselves against Russia, and we've heard about that. Sanctions must be paired with other national security tools to be effective, and I believe that includes supporting Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, and she yields back. With that, we go to Mr. Barr, a gentleman from Kentucky who is also chair of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is important that President Zelensky is here in Washington on Capitol Hill. He is obviously asking Congress for security assistance, but I suspect that President Zelensky is also asking some tough questions of the Biden administration about the ineffectiveness of their sanctions strategy. If you want to win this war, if you want to crush Putin, then you need to abandon this failed price cap strategy and a strategy of a gaping loophole in American sanctions against Russia. Let's explore that for a minute, Mr. Billingsley. So let's talk about the Biden administration's oil price cap strategy. Our previous witness just defended, but it's failed. It's not curbing Moscow's war spending for two reasons. The cap is unenforceable, the Ghost Fleet and other issues, and Russian oil and gas is trading well above the cap. Oil and gas revenues to Russia in October more than doubled from September and rose by more than a quarter from the same month last year. Russian oil and gas revenues for October exceeded 1.5 trillion rubles, or over $17 billion. Mr. Billingsley, it is true that the Biden administration imposed sanctions on Russian banks at the outset of the further invasion back in 2022. The problem is there's a gaping loophole, and it's called license number 8, and it was reissued in October of this year. It permits U.S. persons to engage in any transaction with sanctioned Russian financial institutions if the transaction involves Russian energy. That's the whole ball of wax. You can sanction Russian banks, but if they're allowed, if U.S. financial firms are allowed to process energy-related transactions, how is that curbing the financing that Putin actually needs to fund this war?
Congressman, it's not. The oil price cap is performative art. It was implemented because the Biden administration felt pressure to do something on Russian energy exports, and so they came up with this concept of the price cap, which most of us said is completely unenforceable. Not just because of the Ghost Fleet, but because of the evasion techniques that you can use. The Russians themselves have been buying increasing number of antiquated Greek vessels, and they're simply upcharging on the shipping side as opposed to charging above the price cap itself. Or there are trade-based money laundering schemes in effect which have separate contracts being let for other commodities to be routed through China into Russia. But if we wanted to have effective sanctions on Russia, we have to do two things, neither of which the administration has yet done sufficiently. The first is complete sanctions on the financial sector. The Biden administration has only sanctioned, albeit a large number of Russian banks, but by no means all of the Russian banks are under U.S. sanctions. And when you're in a state-controlled economy, it becomes a Ponzi scheme where they simply move and flow the finances through those financial institutions that are unsanctioned.
Should we remove the general license?
You should.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And we've asked Wally Adeyemo and Secretary Yellen to do this. They say that they're being tough on Russia, but they're not, because they're not removing the general license on all energy transactions.
All one has, it's a very simple one-page general license that simply says, yeah, we imposed all these sanctions on these Russian banks, but it doesn't count as long as it's energy trade. So they're signaling to the world, it's fine to transact with these sanctioned Russian banks as long as it's under the auspices of buying Russian oil.
So the cap, so Russian oil and gas is trading above the oil cap, and the Biden administration is still allowing U.S. firms to process energy-related transactions that is funding this war.
In October, Russia pulled in $11.3 billion in oil revenue, which is more than it did at any month during the year prior to its further attack on Ukraine.
Let's talk about this India issue. Yes, India is a large purchaser of Russian. That's how Russia is circumventing sanctions. Also, exports to China. Should we impose secondary sanctions on these other purchasers to deter this circumvention of the sanctions?
It's the only way you can do it. You have to have secondaries.
So we can talk tough about, hey, we need more security assistance to Ukraine, but if we don't stop the financing of this war, we're never going to see victory for the Ukrainian people. We want to help Ukraine. Republicans in Congress want to help Ukraine, but we want to see the Biden administration actually produce an effective sanctions policy, and they're not delivering right now.
If I may, I know we're out of time, but I support the ranking member's points. We should absolutely support Ukraine with additional military aid, but it makes little sense to me that we take U.S. taxpayer dollars to buy equipment to give to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians, and we're not choking off the Russian economy and its war machine. We need to do both.
I totally agree, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, go to the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think Ms. Beatty was absolutely correct in the way that she was describing what the administration is doing, and I think the way that the administration is handling this is very effective. I could imagine that a ban would lead to American consumers paying $6, $7, or $8 per gallon at the pump. And so I think we have to be careful about the criticism that one may have about the administration, because I don't think that there's any proof that a ban would work any better than what the administration is doing. I want to turn to Mr. Smith. The Biden administration is overseeing the most comprehensive set of sanctions on both Iran and Russia, adding hundreds of additional entities and individuals to the sanctions list. The Biden administration has also carried out robust enforcement actions, and yet, with the ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine, Congress is interested in what more we can do to further tighten our sanctions regimes against Russia and Iran. What are the constraints that the Biden administration is facing when it comes to sanctions enforcement, and what could be done to alleviate these constraints? Now, knowing exactly what the administration is doing and hearing some defense of what they're doing from both Ms. Beatty and myself, what do you recommend? What else could be done effectively?
Thank you, Congresswoman, Ranking Member. It's a good question, and I think more can be done, as I said in my oral testimony and have written about in my written testimony. In broad strokes, it's enforcement. That is where we are falling down, and so we need to fully fund and support the integrated enforcement efforts of the U.S. government and our multilateral partners. And that's not just on sanctions, because in some respects, it's not just choking the economy of Russia we need to be concerned about in the Russia context. It's making sure they can't use that money to help fund their war machine. And that's the most critical piece. It's certainly true that Russia is making more money now from its exports than they were, but the reality is that Putin is not fighting the war he wants to be fighting because of our restrictions, sanctions, export controls, and others. And the stories are legion with respect to using convicts for his troops, having to go to commercial products to sort of find microchips that he can repurpose, all these sorts of things. It is not the 21st military he wants to fight. Is he back in his barracks yet? No. That doesn't mean the restrictions we have in place are not working, and they could work. On the Iran side, again, the big issue there is similar to the Russia one. It is a problem if people are sending money to Iran. However, it's significantly more problematic if that money is then going to their bad activities, be it nuclear production, missile development, or otherwise, or being sent out for goods, services, money to the Houthis, Hamas, etc. Again, the focus there needs to be on the enforcement, the surveillance, because the sanctions are in place. As Secretary Yellen has said, we need to have enforcement and surveillance regarding what's going into Iran and stopping what's going out of Iran, both from a goods and military perspective for Hamas, Hezbollah, et cetera, and financing, be it on the crypto space or the fiat space. Both of those things need to sort of be tightened up, and I think they can be.
Well, thank you so very much. And I certainly agree with the need to have real enforcement because I'm concerned about Russia and Iran having a close relationship, as seen by several recent meetings that brought Iranian and Hamas leaders to Moscow. I'm very concerned about these two nations conspiring to evade U.S. sanctions. And so what you describe as enforcement, I think could be very effective. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, the lady yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Muser is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. There's certainly a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack. Try to ask you how to unpack some of it. So the Biden administration's literally head-scratching approach of appeasement towards Iran and Venezuela, as well as others, is a significant departure from the previous administration's strategy. Frankly, I think we can all easily agree on that. The shift from a robust maximum pressure campaign against Iran to facilitating almost $100 billion in monetary waivers and oil sales. Such decisions impact U.S. security, but have profound implications for our allies, notably Israel. Iran continues to fill up its war chest, and Venezuela is escalating military activities near Guyana. It's why this committee is critically assessing such failures. So as our foreign policy prioritizes appeasement over strength, appeasing hostile regimes does not bring peace, it undermines it. So again, just some truths I think we all could agree. Mr. Billingsley, Trump administration did have a virtually maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which cut off approximately $80 billion in oil sales, leaving their cash coffers in the $4 billion range, where today it's near $100 billion, since the Biden administration came in. So would a maximum pressure campaign, what do you think of the Biden administration's policy, and would resuming a maximum pressure campaign right now have the intended effects of minimizing Iran as the center of terrorist activities throughout the Middle East and the world?
When we came to office, we found that Iran was flush with cash as a result of the JCPOA deal. And they were spreading that cash around quite freely to terrorist groups across the region and funding, and those terrorist groups funding cells all over the world, including in our own hemisphere here. So as we began the maximum pressure campaign and reimposed sanctions on the Iranian regime, we actually saw that cash dry up, and we saw a significant reduction in the capacity of these terrorist organizations to conduct operations and to actually engage in the kinds of activities to undermine our regional allies. So absolutely, I believe that we should reimpose, and we don't actually have to reimpose anything. We simply need to start enforcing the sanctions that President Biden was given by our administration.
Do you think this was the main reason, main catalyst, main level of funding and support, which has caused the chaos that exists in the Middle East and between Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and God knows who else?
They all clearly feel emboldened, but make no mistake, Congressman, their instructions, their orders come from Tehran.
Right. So this whole thing with Iran proxy, we might as well just say Iran when we're referencing it. Ms. Youngman, what do you think Iran's doing with all of this extra cash that they're getting from selling their oil throughout the world, and particularly to China?
I thank you for your question. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with my colleagues here who have said, we have the sanctions on the books, they need to be enforced. And without that enforcement, Iran's able to accumulate revenue, as we've discussed, $80 billion, and this money is being used to fund its nuclear program, terrorist proxies, and so on. We need to enforce these sanctions. We need to crack down on the ghost fleet. and Panama's facilitation of these vessels involved as well.
On to Venezuela, Dr. Berg. So again, I'm using the word appeasement often because that seems to be the ideology and the approach. Was the handling of Venezuela the right approach? They seem pretty emboldened. Your thoughts on the Venezuela situation?
Thanks very much, Congressman, for that question. Look, sanctions are a tactic and a broader strategy. So what are our sanctions for in the case of Venezuela? They're for trying to get freer and fairer elections under the Maduro regime as the starting point for a broader redemocratization effort. The problem with the recent strategy, I would contend, is that we gave away everything up front simply to get the regime to the table. And now we're devoid of leverage to be able to get candidate bans lifted for actual opposition candidates to be able to run in Venezuela. That's the fundamental problem, Congressman.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. That would go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and also thank you for bringing this very important committee hearing together. And I want to thank the people who are here testifying. Appeasement has been mentioned a few times, and I have to say, I do think that at the moment we're appeasing Russia. I mean, obviously, we're not strongly behind Ukraine. We haven't been able to give them the aid now that they need. In fact, I was very sad to see in the last vote that we took, I think over 100 of my colleagues on the other side voted against supporting aid to Ukraine. Appeasement doesn't work, and I think that that's a real problem. We have to be much more aggressive here in helping Ukraine. You don't help Ukraine by throwing them to the dogs. That's not the way you help them. I mean, I think you have to have stronger sanctions. I agree with everyone that has said that we have to enforce them. They have to be stronger. One thing that really wasn't mentioned much, though, is liquefied natural gas. We obviously see that there's less natural gas going into the EU from Russia, through pipelines, but now you have an increase in LNG. And we don't do much about that, of course, obviously, because of the strategy that Merkel and others had. But what can we do there? I mean, again, I look at that and I say that's a real problem. We are doing more in the sense of sending more LNG ourselves, but what can we do? That's a real problem. If you talk about money, money's fungible, and they're getting a lot of money from LNG. Anyone want to take a crack at that? Mr. Berg, Dr. Berg, you seem like you're anxious to take a crack at that. Go ahead, sir.
Congressman, I think this question would probably better be directed at my colleague Anna, who actually mentioned liquefied natural gas in her opening statement.
Happy to direct it towards her. You just seemed anxious at the bit.
Well, it's an interesting and very important part of the equation. In fact, between 2021 and today, Russian liquefied natural gas exports have doubled, and half of this goes to Europe. Europe does not sanction any flows of natural gas from Russia, besides a couple of countries that refuse to pay in rubles for those flows, and that's going to be Poland and Bulgaria. Otherwise, whatever gas flows to Europe from Russia, Europe is taking. For liquefied natural gas, it's actually quite interesting because most of it is being produced by what's called an independent Russian company, if any company, especially energy company in Russia, could be independent. And I think that's what a lot of companies and countries are hanging onto in justifying their imports of natural gas or transshipments. So allowing Russian tankers from Arctic to basically change to move the liquefied natural gas to less expensive vessels to send them further out. This is a serious problem because what we basically do is we are financing or we are allowing, I'm talking about US but our allies as well, for Russian company to grow and to still claim it is a regular market actor. I doubt it in many ways, and we've seen already UCOS, which was a private company, but very quickly became a public company when Putin decided it's not in the interest of Russian state. So that's...
Thank you again. I appreciate it, because I do think that this is a big issue that we haven't looked at. We have to. The other thing that was talked about quite a bit here, and I have interest in this, is the ghost fleet. I mean, obviously, that's very, very problematic, and 48% of it being from Panama, Mr. Smith, you've been shaking your head. What can we do further there to discourage this or to end it? I mean, we shouldn't have these ghost fleets flying around there or sailing around there, creating these problems.
No, agreed. And one of the reasons for this is not just sanctions and enforcement, but ghost fleets are often moribund, unsafe, non-environmental. There are accidents waiting to happen. And they're often not insured. In fact, by definition, they're not insured by the major insurers. And so that's a real risk. And so the reality, though, is that they are ghost fleets and they are, broadly speaking, off the radar.
But how can we enforce something against them if they are ghosts? I mean, they're ghosts, but they're not really ghosts. You can see them, they're there.
Exactly. They're not actually ghosts. And so there's still a way for them to be attached to the non-ghost world, be it insurance, be it infrastructure or otherwise. And again, it's focusing on the intermediaries that are not ghosts, right? That are actually in the real economy. That's going to be the way forward.
Well, we need to go after, my time is up here. I apologize for interrupting you.
No.
But again, I appreciate you being here and everyone else. And thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I'm sure we now know all about ghosts. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. As sanctions evasion tactics evolve for rogue countries like Iran and Russia, many of our witnesses have described how U.S. enforcement efforts on sanctions require new sanctions on new entities. The brutal and senseless attacks on October 7th by Hamas is a stark reminder that we cannot relent the pressure of sanctions on the Ayatollah regime. Ms. Youngman, as noted in your testimony, it seems that the Biden administration has relaxed the enforcement of sanctions on Iranian oil. So can you tell us which countries have the most to gain from a lax enforcement of sanctions on oil produced in rogue countries like Russia and Iran?
Thank you for your question. So the country that's benefiting most from this lax sanctions enforcement is China. China is able to purchase cheap oil, not just from Iran, but also from Venezuela and Russia as well. And its economy benefits from that, while other countries have higher oil prices and gas prices as a result. So the main benefiter here is China.
As you said, the Chinese imports of sanctioned Iranian oil are running at the highest level in at least a decade. Other reports say that about 80% of Iranian crude exports go to China. It seems these so-called Chinese teapots, which are small refineries like Iran's oil at a discount, are part of the problem. According to Reuters, Chinese teapots have been top buyers of Venezuelan oil since 2019, and these teapot refineries are being used as a way to circumvent the U.S. sanctions on oil produced in Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. So, Ms. Youngman, again, in your testimony, you lay out recommendations to disincentivize the use of Chinese teapot refineries. Can you tell us if the Biden administration has taken any actions to reduce the flow of sanctioned oil into teapot refineries based in China?
As of today, I don't believe they've taken any efforts to reduce the oil sales into China, specifically targeting entities in China. We need to be sanctioning the Chinese banks, the companies involved in this trade, and, like you mentioned, the teapots, which are responsible for importing almost all Iranian oil and restricting their access to the U.S. financial system.
Can you please elaborate on your recommendations to reduce the imports of sanctioned oil into these teapot refineries?
As I mentioned in my testimony, Panama flags 48% of these vessels. Panama should be a U.S. ally. Panama is a U.S. ally. Why are we not putting more pressure on Panama to reduce the vessels involved in this type of activity? Without the use of Panama-flagged vessels, Iran would have a much harder capability of selling its oil. Again, 48% is being transported, 48% is flagged by Panama, and Iranian oil is being used and shipped on these vessels. So if we were able to, restrict tariffs on Panamanian goods entering the U.S. market, for example, is one reason. Put the pressure on Panama.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mikulska, Can you shed light on the strategic alliance between Russia and China in the energy sector over the last half century, and what aspects of the current relationship are worrisome?
So the Russia and China relation hasn't been always very easy, and I don't think it is easy at this moment. However, they have definitely been, the countries have been closer. China, in particularly because China wants so. Russia has been pushing China to cooperate, in particular, for example, in natural gas sales for decades. It hasn't happened until 2014 when Russia was hit with some sanctions, and China could feel that Russia is going to be the junior partner in the relation. So that's how the relation is basically now going, with Russia becoming even more impacted with sanctions, even more reliant on China, including new potential pipelines.
Do you see if there are any gaps that additional U.S. sanctions could potentially help mitigate?
I think if we enforce U.S. sanctions to a greater extent, even if China is able to bring more gas or more oil, that market is going to be smaller. And by definition, there is going to be more competition among the rogue state for that market, which means Venezuela, Iran, and Russia will have compete for the same markets, and that prevents them working together. So that's something that we could think of as we contemplate sanctions on each and single one of those countries.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nichols, recognized for 5 minutes.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, for convening this important hearing today. I want to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses for spending your time with us here. Today, we're diving into a topic of great significance, the art of restricting rogue state revenue, with a focus on strengthening our energy sanctions concerning Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. But before we continue, I want to address the pressing issue facing the U.S. Congress, our support for our allies in Ukraine and Israel. President Zelensky is with us in the Congress today, and the Congress needs to act. The inaction of the pro-Russia faction of the Republican conference, while I believe a minority of the conference, is set to be a truly dark stain on the United States, this Congress. We need to stand with Ukraine, especially right now, and support for Ukraine is in our national interest. And to my colleagues who bring up the cost of containing an aggressive Russia around the globe will be 100 times higher if we do nothing and gift wrap Ukraine to Vladimir Putin over this holiday season. So I want to encourage my Republican colleagues to bring the bill to a floor, bring a clean vote, a bill to allow us to support our allies in Ukraine and Israel. The battle here in support of democracies is one of the defining issues of this Congress, and we have to act. But I want to dive into our questions on the topic we're here to talk about today. Dr. Mikulska, I want to start with you. Iran's energy sector is the heart of its economy, the oil revenue, its lifeblood. How effective have our sanctions on Iran's energy industry been so far, and have they put a dent in Iran's ability to fund their various regional activities?
I think this is going to be more of a question for Mr. Jungmann, since I'm focusing on Russia in general, if I can.
Do you want to address that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So sanctions have not been, or sanctions need to be enforced to reduce Iranian oil exports. They have not been over the last few years, and as a result, Iran has been able to accumulate over $80 billion worth of oil revenue, and that's a conservative figure. So again, not effective as of the last few years in comparison to previous administrations.
Congressman, if I could add, today Iran is exporting more than 4 times the amount of crude oil than the day that President Biden took office, just as a reference check.
Thanks. Dr. Berg, next question to you. I recently went to Colombia as part of a CODEL with, led by Congressman Pfluger. We did Brazil, Colombia, Panama, but certainly, you know, the whole visit was defined by Venezuela and the huge influx of immigrants fleeing that oppressive regime, many of them heading to the U.S. border. I got to see firsthand that huge volume of people coming up through the Darien Gap in Panama. Certainly no friend to that regime. We need regime change, but Venezuela's energy sector has certainly seen better days, partly thanks to our sanctions and restrictions. Can you paint us a picture of the current state of affairs in Venezuela's energy industry, and what's the collateral damage these sanctions have caused, and what can we do to balance our foreign policy objectives while addressing those humanitarian concerns?
Well, thanks very much, Congressman, for that question. Currently, on the oil production side of things, Venezuela produces around 800,000 barrels of oil per day. Most experts will tell you that the ceiling, absent a massive capital infusion and a concerted effort to repair a lot of the dilapidated infrastructure in that country, is 1 million barrels of oil per day. Far cry from the heyday of more than 3 million barrels of oil per day at its height in 1998. So Venezuela has done quite a bit, even before U.S. sanctions came into play, to destroy its own oil production capacity. I do think, however, that we need to sever this idea or sunder this idea that just lifting sanctions will all of a sudden see fewer Venezuelan migrants at the border. I do agree with you, Congressman, that we have seen a torrent of migration out of Venezuela, and it mostly has to do with the regime type. It mostly has to do with the fact that this is an incredibly repressive regime that sits in the docket of the International Criminal Court pending an allegation of crimes against humanity. About 8 million or so have left the country. That's a tremendous number. It's the largest out-migration in the world absent a conflict context, right? And that outflow begins in 2014, 2015, again, well before U.S. sanctions even come into play. So I do think we need to get rid of this idea that somehow just lifting the sanctions we're going to see fewer Venezuelan migrants. As you mentioned in your question, it's the regime type. It's the lack of freedoms in the country. And I do worry that another rigged election could be one of those trigger points in 2024 where we see, again, further out-migration.
Thanks. I've exceeded my time. I'll follow up in writing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. On September 11th of this year, 22 years after a foreign terrorist organization carried out the deadliest attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor, the Biden administration granted sanction waiver allowing one of the largest state sponsors of terrorism to access $6 billion in oil revenue with another $10 billion up for consideration. A month later, Iranian-linked terrorists claimed the lives of more than 1,200 innocent Israelis. Just days after that attack in Israel, it was reported that the Biden administration would ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. A few months later, the Venezuelan regime seems poised to invade its sovereign neighbor, Guyana, to claim their oil fields. It appears a pattern is starting to emerge, revealing one thing which should have been obvious to the current administration: easing sanctions to appease dictators and terrorists does not work. Dr. Berg, under the terms of the new General License Agreement, oil and gas exports to Iran and Russia are prohibited. Does the Office of Foreign Asset Control track oil shipments out of Venezuela to enforce this provision?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. It is questionable given the fact that even before the current sanctions lift on Venezuela, enforcement was incredibly lax. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we knew the routes, we knew how much, we knew exactly when and where. They weren't even trying in terms of creative evasion techniques to get around our sanctions. They used to use ghost ships, as has been a focus of this hearing. They used to use what's called spoofing in their AIS transponders, which is saying that they're in one location when they're really in another. They used to do ship-to-ship transfers at high sea. Now they simply go into the Jose port in Venezuela and sail right on out of there in front of everybody to see. So my contention is that enforcement had slipped drastically even before this recent sanction.
So what enforcement authorities does OFAC have?
Well, By the terms of the new arrangement, License 43 and 44, the regime has re-entered international oil and gas markets. But those shipments should be, according to those general licenses, prohibited from going to certain destinations, Russia and Iran among them. And so those are the rules on the books. OFAC should have the ability to enforce that.
See no evil, hear no evil? I mean, we're just turning a blind eye to it?
Congressman, I think we are in a moment where we are seeing the administration reticent to admit that's merely 7 weeks after lifting a significant chunk of sanctions for initial period of 6 months, that the strategy has not worked and that they should reboot. As you mentioned in your question, Venezuela is engaging in bellicose rhetoric with its neighbor Guyana, threatening to annex what amounts to more than 2/3 of their territory. This is not the type of behavior that we would expect a sanctions lift to induce. And so I think there is a reticence on behalf of the administration there to admit that less than 2 months later, we're not seeing the behavior change we expected.
All right. I'd like to shift over to Ms. Youngman. If, as we talk about illicit oil shipments, I think it's important that we consider how existing sanctions on Iranian oil shipments would be improved by addressing Iran's so-called Ghost Armada, as we've been discussing here, meaning that the ships illegally facilitate the movement of Iranian oil to purchasers abroad. One question I have is regarding the insurance of these ships. How are they insured?
Majority of the vessels involved in this type of activity are not insured by the international P&I clubs. They are using, in some cases, Iranian insured companies, or in other cases, they're just operating with no insurance, which is a could have dangerous consequences. But in some cases, there are vessels insured by the American Steamship Owners Club, as well as others involved as members of the International P&I Club.
So there's some level of cooperation of insurers to strip the insurance from these vessels?
Yes, absolutely. Part of what United Against Nuclear Iran does is we provide all of these different insurance companies with evidence of these vessels transporting Iranian oil and call on them to withdraw their coverage.
So my understanding is the Panamanian Maritime Authority flags more than 16% of the world's shipping fleet by tonnage and 40% of the ships in Iran's so-called Ghost Armada. Are there any consequences for Panama when their Maritime Authority flags or reflags ships known to transport Iranian oil?
There have not been any consequences, and there should be.
Okay. I see my time is running out. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Gonzalez, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you for the guests that are here today. My question is to Ms. Youngman. As you know, the last administration withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iranian nuclear deal, believing that as a singular nation, our ability to sanction were more powerful than the multilateral plan. Now Iran has expelled several inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, hamstringing their ability to monitor Tehran's program, which is concerning since we know their ability to enrich uranium is growing. In your opinion, what is the best way to limit Iran's growing threat to the U.S. and its allies? Is it through a unilateral economic sanction, secondary sanctions, multilateral sectorial sanctions? What would you suggest?
I think in the case of Iran, the sanctions are on the books. They need to be enforced, and they have not been. And that's where part of the problem is. We don't see Iranian oil currently going to European countries. So in those cases, multilateral sanctions may not be effective. It needs to be but the sanctions that the U.S. need to be enforced to crack down on.
So you think what we have is effective, it's just not being enforced, and that's
Absolutely.
major. That's
Yeah, and we've seen it work. We saw it work in the past under the maximum pressure campaign.
Very well, thank you. My next question is to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, Iran has boasted that they're pros at circumventing sanctions, and China is on the record for helping Russia evade U.S. sanctions. Suffice it to say that we have a problem. These entities are funneling money into terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah through shadow banking places like the UAE. It seems that every time we impose a round of sanctions targeting the shells or individuals who aid in circumvention, China, Russia, or Iran find another way around. How do you suggest Congress put an end to this? And can we ensure our sanctions how can we ensure they make the most impact? I know we've been talking about enforcing what we have. It certainly is one, but what other suggestions do you have?
Thank you, Congressman. I mean, enforcement, not to sort of beat the drum, but that obviously is a critical piece. Because again, the challenge is not so much the money that Iran has, but how they're using that money. And so enforcement and surveillance of how they're using it and going to these shadow banking environments, be it in the Gulf or in places like Turkey, those are the places I think we need to sort of engage and make sure that they are all aware of what's happening in their systems. We had a good experience when I was at Treasury many years ago, engaging with many of these same jurisdictions, and we got good uptake with respect to their own concerns. Because at the end of the day, the shadow banks are one thing, but the jurisdictions in which they live, they want to be seen as legitimate and reasonable and responsible parts of the international financial community. So I do think there's leverage there so that they can make sure that they remain as such and not be subjected to restrictions or even reputational harm if their entire systems are sort of overtaken by these shadow entities.
Yeah, so engage in some of these third countries.
Indeed.
And Dr. Berg, do you believe lifting sanctions as a reward for good behavior and the subsequent threat of reimposing them as means for deterrence is an effective strategy?
Congressman, thanks for the question. To characterize Venezuela's strategy over the last 2 administrations, I think the goal was to get to a freer and fairer election. And sanctions are just a tactic in that overall broader strategy. So how the 2 administrations have gone about it, of course, differ dramatically, but I think that's been a broadly shared bipartisan goal with deep buy-in here on the Hill as well. I would argue that the flaw in the current approach, Congressman, is that we've given away too much at the start. We gave away too much to get to the regime to the table, and now we're devoid of any sort of leverage to be able to get them to lift those candidate bans that arbitrarily prevent them from facing any real opposition in the election. We've got a woman who's got incredible enthusiasm, Maria Corina Machado, who won 92% of the vote in the opposition's primary. The opposition's primary drove more people to the voting booth than the regime's ploy this past weekend to get Venezuelans to vote for the annexation of Guyana, and yet she's unable to run for president in the 2024 elections. We've got to find a way to use our sanctions to make her an eligible candidate. I think that's the key to this whole puzzle.
I can't agree more. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we'll go to the gentleman from Iowa. Mr. Nunn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Luke DeMeyer, for scheduling this timely hearing, and to all of you who have just a deep level of expertise here. Look, as a former counterintelligence officer, I have personally witnessed the shady tactics of several of the regimes we've been talking about today, and worked to combat these nefarious relationships with many of the fellow adversaries we've highlighted. Their tactics, as we've highlighted, are not new, but our ability to respond to them must continue to evolve. Today, we hold this hearing to inform policy proposals and determine the best course of action to prevent illegal oil exports from our largest adversaries. Clearly, the sanctions and the oil price caps imposed by the Biden administration are not working, with both Israel and Russia reporting more profits from oil sales than ever before these wars began. So let's get started. Mr. Billingsley, I've led a bill called the Stop Terrorism and Illicit Financing Location Exploitation Act, or the STIFLE Act, which I'm proud to be leading with Ranking Member Beatty. Attached to this hearing would require the Treasury to look at the implementation of different forms of precise locations of tracking instead of relying on traditional IP addresses, which have been used since 1974, and as we've all highlighted, are easily spoofed and manipulated. As we've seen recently, over 98% of blocked compliance transactions from Iran had non-Iranian IP addresses, 97% for those in Syria, and 85% of those blocked in Palestine. It's time for the Treasury to start implementing new sanctions technology and not continuing to rely on something that was last used during the late days of the Ford administration. Given your experience as a former Treasury Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, our largest foreign adversaries are using sophisticated technology to circumvent sanctions that we've discussed today. Would you agree with this?
Yes, we're not keeping pace.
Would this STIFLE Act that myself and the ranking member on the Democratic side have introduced to lead financing institutions to more accurately choose geolocation forms that help prevent money laundering by these terrorist organizations be a step in the right direction?
I appreciate your staff gave me the chance to look at the bill last night, so I gave it a read. I think it's definitely headed in the right direction. I might offer, for jurisdictional reasons, I understand the way it is framed. Ultimately, I would say within TFI, you might want to make this the obligation of the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence, OIA, for the Office of Intelligence Analysis, to prepare that assessment that you call for. But you would, I would suggest, may want to then have my former job evaluate whether or not the intelligence community is following through and providing the actionable intelligence necessary to disrupt these activities. As you may know, within the Treasury, the international effector is TFFC, is terrorist financing and financial crimes. So they're ultimately the customer of the intelligence community who needs to furnish much better, much more comprehensive lead information on who these bad actors are.
Mr. Billingsley, that's excellent, and I appreciate that feedback. It helps us get both to the point where we're collecting and assessing correct on the intelligence side, as then being able to implement effectively on the holding them accountable side. Which leads me directly to Ms. Jungmann. I want to speak specifically to this oil situation that we've reviewed with Iran. Is it true that China is the leading buyer of illicit Iranian oil?
Yes, it is, 72%.
Is it true that Iran sales have increased nearly 400% since 2020?
Yes.
Is it also true that in the last 2 years, Iran has added $80 billion to its coffee from the sale of illegal oil that is then transferred on to Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi rebels, other terrorist groups?
That's correct, and it's a conservative figure.
So from that, I want to talk about the clearest challenge that we have is not just stopping the exportation of this, but how this oil is being transferred out of Iran to these buyers. Is this being provided by an armada of literally ghost ships that are no longer being tracked or able to intercept?
Yes, it's they're being transported on what's called the Ghost Fleet. And the Ghost Fleet got that term not because of actually ghosts, but because they are using discrete or different methods to try to evade the sanctions, such as ship-to-ship transfers, manipulating their transponders, flag hopping. However, our organization does this type of tracking, and if a small nonprofit like us can do it, we believe that there are other entities around within the U.S. government or outside of that to be able to do the tracking as well and then enforce those sanctions on the vessels.
In fact, from the oldest days of privacy, perhaps one of the best ways to go after this is going after these insurance vessels. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentlewoman from Texas. Ms. De La Cruz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. We do appreciate it. At our last committee hearing, a witness provided written testimony that, quote, Hezbollah earns large sums through drug smuggling, cigarette smuggling, currency counterfeiting, and arms smuggling, much of which occurs in Latin America. As a South Texan, the idea of terrorist groups raising funds in our part of the world simply is just unacceptable, especially as our ally Israel battles with these groups. Mr. Berg, last year it was reported that Hezbollah illegally sent gold from Venezuela to the Middle East to finance militias. Can you share with my colleagues and I the extent of Hezbollah activities in Venezuela?
Thanks, Congresswoman, for this excellent question, because we've drawn a lot of nexes in this hearing so far between the three countries that are covered, but Venezuela's been less addressed, and so this gives an opportunity to show that Venezuela is part of this pack, just as Russia and Iran are. We know that throughout the years there were schemes to give passports to those from Iran and from the Hezbollah group, from Venezuelan officials to set up networks within Venezuela. And we also know that Hezbollah is incredibly active in what we call the tri-border area in South America, the border between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. As you mentioned in your question, it's cigarette smuggling, it's drug smuggling, it's money laundering, but it's also other terrorist activities. We need to remember, because it's been a while, but in the 1990s, there were 2 attacks in Argentina, one in 92, one in 94, one on a Jewish community building, the other on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. that showed that this group has a real capability in South America to actually attack physical targets. We need to remember that Latin America and the Caribbean is our neighborhood, it's our shared neighborhood, and there's a real capability for this group to actually perform terrorist acts, not just engage in illicit financing and other activities that then sends resources back to the Levant.
So, aside from passports and giving passports to these terrorist groups, what are some of the other activities that Venezuela created in order to make these activities thrive in Venezuela?
So in 2016, Congresswoman, the Maduro regime designated an area called the Orinoco Mining Arc. It's about the size of Portugal in the southern part of Venezuela in the Amazonian region, and that is essentially a state-sponsored policy of illegal gold mining. And a lot of that gold is suspected was ferried out in the cargo holds of Venezuelan state-owned airlines like Conviasa to places like Iran in the Middle East. Gold is obviously very easily layered and refined and smelted in a way that can make it difficult to track in the supply chain. And we suspect that, of course, the cargo holds of those planes held many billions in illicit gold. And so even if these two countries were sanctioned, and even if the enforcement was kept very tight, which was questionable, as we've discussed today, you have these illicit workarounds through things like illicit gold mining, which clearly link Venezuela and Iran.
Thank you so much for your comments. And as I said in the beginning of my remarks, it's simply unacceptable that terrorist activities like the ones you just described go unchecked in Latin America. And that's why I recently introduced a package that included HR 6589. I'd love for you to take a look at that. And it's called to prevent the financing of terrorism through the Drug Trade Act, so that Congress can get a better understanding of just what is going on with these terrorist groups, not only here, but in South America, including Venezuela. Thank you so much for your time. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Tennessee. Mr. Ockles is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate your time. We're nearing the end. Mr. Billingsley and Ms. Jungmann, I really want to focus on the impact that when you look at this triad, in particular Iran and Russia, how the impact that it's had on, I guess, U.S. national security, but then also in the shadows of October 7th. When you look at the Iranian cash flows from oil, when you look at, even in Ukraine, where we're being asked as members of Congress to vote on aid packages for Ukraine. Meanwhile, sanctions aren't going far enough if you're truly trying to come to some sort of end game in Ukraine-Russia conflict of really, tightening down on the Russian economy and or the funding of the war machine. So just to recap, Mr. Billingsley, give me an estimated value of the oil that Iran exports annually in violation of U.S. sanctions.
I believe my testimony, I have the volume. You may have a better estimate of the number, but it's back up to the levels before we imposed sanctions on them during the Trump administration. So they've gone right back to where they were at the end of Obama.
Is it fair to say that the monies that Iran is generating through the sale of oil is flowing its way back into, obviously, the Middle East and around the world, but specifically to fund terrorism?
Absolutely.
Would you consider that Biden's, their sanctions against Iran and this nexus between the three countries sufficient to stop the flow of money and or stop the funding of terrorism globally?
Well, it's clearly not been, right? So there was yet another Houthi attack on a shipping vessel in the Red Sea last night. As I mentioned in my testimony, there have been 92 attacks against U.S. service members by Iranian proxy groups in Syria and Iraq since October 17th. By the way, with regard to Venezuela, the Iranians have been cultivating a relationship there, and Hezbollah as well. The Revolutionary Guard Quds Force general, who was responsible for arming the Houthis and training them on drones and ballistic missiles before he had a heart attack, started traveling to Venezuela. That, and by the way, those drones and those missiles, if they are ultimately supplied to the Venezuelan regime, will have South Texas in range. So this is a huge issue for us, and the Iranian regime is largely now unconstrained and unfettered from a resource standpoint. They've gone right back to where they were after the JCPOA was enacted by the Obama administration.
So, I mean, again, we saw, you know, there's a silver lining in the attack on October 7th in that it was just one of the terrorist groups in that neck of the woods, so to speak, versus the Houthis and some of the other rogue actors in that neighborhood. That being said, as we move forward, whether it's Iran, when you look at a holistic package of what we have to do to make the world safe again, and when you look on that front of global terrorism, what do we do next? And how quickly must we act to prevent the next 9/11?
I'll give you a chance to jump in. We need to come down incredibly hard on the Iranian economy, and we need to support the protesters who are still there protesting for their rights. This is a regime that is the foremost sponsor of terrorism in the world, and they will not change their spots under any circumstance.
Ms. Youngman, would you like to jump in here rather quickly?
Sure. So as we've all talked about, enforcement of sanctions is essential, but I would also like to add that funding support to the Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Security Investigation Office would also be essential. The Iran Sanctions Enforcement Act would provide seed funding for HSI to be able to do physical interdictions of these vessels carrying Iranian oil, and then that reinforces the effectiveness of sanctions.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out, thank you for this hearing, but there's a clear connection between illicit finance, the three countries of conversation of topic today, and ultimately linking back to Israel and the horrific attacks, the terrorist attacks that took place in that peninsula. And when you look at our southern border, which is wide open, when you look at the Syrians and the Iranians that we know are now in this country, in this room, in one of the hearings in this room, there was testimony that we know that there are terror cells operating in the United States of America. We know that there's Iranian assassins operating here in the United States of America, and that is solely the responsibility of the Biden administration, solely the responsibility of this open border, and their lack of commitment to truly shutting down illegal, illicit activity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we're out of individuals asking questions. I do have a quick comment, and I got a question as well here. Headline that I was reading here this morning is that there was a explosion at an Iranian oil refinery. And Mr. Billings, I don't know if you're aware of it, or any of you on the committee are aware of it, said that all 18 reserves were destroyed. What kind of effect would that have on Iran's ability to market their oil? One of their big refineries goes up in flames.
It would have a substantial effect.
So they don't have dozens of the refineries, so if they lose 1 out of 5, it's a 20% hit to their ability to export oil?
Yes, sir.
Wow. In that same article, we talked this morning about ghost ships and some of the problems in following them. But in this article, it talked about some of the ships that are being targeted by this group, and it's amazing. And I just lost it here. Here we go. That this it was a Panama. No, it wasn't. Where was it here? It was flagged by Bahamas. It was flagged in the Bahamas. It was a Bahama-flagged ship that was leased to a Japanese company from a British firm that was partially owned by an Israeli businessman. I can't follow that. How does everybody else follow that? I mean, it's if that's the layers of stuff that they go to protect this, to have ghost ships, to be able to, cause us to have to go digging and digging and digging to find stuff. It's amazing. I don't know if you want to comment on
Chairman, having been also the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, I can tell you naval intelligence follows these vessels very, very closely. In fact, when I was at the Treasury, I went out to the Office of Naval Intelligence and gave them an award for the help that they were providing to us. I routinely had to go to Panama and furnish them with details of vessels that they were flagging. And yes, they would deflag them, but they weren't going to look on their own. They really just aren't that interested. So we need to make it their business to care about not providing flags of convenience to both Iranian and Russian vessels.
Do they make more money when they flag it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so there's a monetary incentive here as well.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to jump in.
Yeah, I just read, after the chairman shared that, I just read the article as well about the 18 refineries, but it also talked about, and I don't know how to convert this, the 1.5 million liters of oil. That just sounds like that could be devastating to them and to, as I think Ranking Member Waters talked about, how the prices could go up then for us here, and that, you know, all of this is interrelated. So we have to be very careful because we know what happens in our economy when across the United States we start hitting $5, $6, $7 per gallon.
Very good. Okay, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. It was a great hearing, and you guys did a great job of articulating a lot of information for us. We thank you for that. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for the response. I ask our witness to please respond as promptly as possible. With that, the hearing is adjourned. Good job.